Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. It's always a joyful prospect for me to interview yet another Fiona McIntosh masterclasser who has found publishing success. Today, that author is Mercier, author of the brilliant debut White Noise, published by HarperCollins earlier this year. Drawn from Mercedes' real-life experience working in the Australian correction system for almost a decade, White Noise is a triumph of a novel. I was utterly mesmerised by the world Mercedes created, the ongoing effects of trauma and addiction, along with her chilling insight into the mind of a psychopath. A brilliant read for lovers of crime and psychological thrillers. So I'm delighted to welcome Mercedes to the podcast today. Hi, Mercedes.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, I'm delighted to have you. And I wanted to say once more, even though I said it before we started recording, congratulations. Your book has received so many terrific reviews and attention, and I'm absolutely delighted for you.
Thank you so much. That means so much, especially coming from, someone like you.
Oh, you're so kind. Now, I confess that I'm always a little bit wary of a book that is so universally acclaimed because I worry it won't live up to the hype. But on this occasion, it absolutely did. And I said it before, there wasn't an ounce of fat in this story. It was so compelling. I just loved it. And I was in awe of your skill, especially as a debut. So I wanted to ask you, how long was this novel in the making?
I would say years. So I have always loved reading crime. I've always read crime. My mum's been a huge fan of crime novels. We had crime novels throughout the house.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually start out writing crime. I was writing commercial fiction, sort of romance elements, those style of books when I went to Fiona McIntosh's masterclass in 2016. And Fiona sat me down after having read the first 10 pages of that manuscript and said, Mercedes, with your background in the criminal justice system, it's so unique. You get such a, interesting insight into the criminal justice system that a lot of other people might not get. Why on earth are you not writing crime? And I listened to her and I took it on board. But silly me didn't actually take her advice for another few years. So I continued to write in the romance genre, which I loved, and put lots and lots of manuscripts out into the world, but unfortunately got lots and lots of rejections. And then it wasn't probably until about 2020 when, COVID had hit. I had a bit more time on my hands. I wasn't commuting to and from work, so I had a couple of extra hours in my day, and I just sat down and I thought, why can't I write a crime novel? For so many years I'd been really intimidated by the genre because I've loved reading it so much, and I've read all of these incredible crime novels. I just thought, oh gosh, I can't live up to these wonderful books that I've read, and rightly so. Crime readers expect a lot out of a crime novel. You want to be surprised, you want there to be twists, turns, lots of clues, lots of red herrings, and so for the longest time, I just thought it was something that was out of my reach, I guess, and then. In 2020, I sat down and I had Fiona's words, sort of circling in the back of my head. And I'd always known that if I wanted to write a crime novel, I wanted to write it in a prison. I wanted to set it in a prison because of my background in, corrections and the criminal justice system. I just knew that was always where I wanted to set it. So I sat down in these extra couple of hours that I had in my day, and I started writing, and it just sort of poured out of me, I guess. I found as soon as I started writing, I had so much to say and such a strong story that just came into my head from basically the day I started writing. It's not to say writing, the whole the whole novel was easy. It was definitely work, but I think I just knew once I started writing, yes, this is what I'm meant to have been writing all along, and yeah, and this is what I should be doing.
That's a brilliant story. Thank you for sharing that because you're not alone. I'm sure there are plenty of listeners out there who are listening to this going, wow, it doesn't just happen to me, it happens to other people. And to see that you finally found success is incredibly hopeful and heartening. So, Mercedes, what actually inspired this particular story?
Like I said, I always knew that I wanted to set my crime novel in a prison because I've got all of the experience, I've got all of the stories and the background and the knowledge. But it wasn't until I sat down with one of my friends who is a criminal psychologist, and I work with her in the same department, and we catch up for lunch regularly. And one day she was just telling me about her day, and she was telling me about how one of her, jobs for the day was this risk assessment for an inmate who was coming up to parole. And it was her job to, speak to him, analyse him, and assess the risk of him being released onto parole. And then her report goes to, the parole authority, and that's one of the many aspects that they take into consideration. But I was just sitting there and I just thought, what a huge responsibility to be sitting on this one person's shoulders. And what happens if something goes wrong? But I also thought it's such an incredibly challenging job that there's not a lot known about it, and there's not a lot of light shone on it a lot of the time. And so I thought I would love to pitch a really clever, really charming, manipulative inmate against an equally clever, switched on psychologist, and just watch how that plays out and watch that power play. And so I think, yeah, that lunch was the inspirational sort of the kernel that got White Noise started.
Before we get on to the actual story, as someone who lives less than 2 kilometres from Sydney's Long Bay Jail, I was fascinated by your description of the fictional Westmead prison and what it would be like to work in a jail. But I wondered, given that you're Adelaide based, why you decided to set your novel in Sydney.
Mostly it was to avoid, I guess, any sort of conflict. I still work in the criminal justice system, so I didn't want to set it in South Australia and have people assume then that it was based on a South Australian prison. It's not. Westmead isn't based on any one prison. It's not based on a South Australian prison or a Sydney prison. It's just sort of an amalgamation of a lot of prisons that I've spent time in and gone through in my time. So yeah, that's why I set it in Sydney, and I have spent a lot of time in Sydney. But unfortunately, when I started writing it was during COVID, when there was all the travel restrictions. So unfortunately, I couldn't get up there to walk the streets and do that level of research that I would have loved to have done. So Google Earth, Google Maps was my best friend, and I spent many hours, walking the streets of Bondi where it's set, and just looking around and immersing myself in it through the computer screen as much as I could, and drawing on memories of when I spent time in Sydney. But I was up there recently for the Bad Crime Sydney Festival, and I spent an afternoon in Bondi, and I was like, thankfully, it looked exactly the same as it did on Google Maps. Of course it does. But, it was really lovely to be able to get there and walk the streets that Laura walked, and head down to the beach and just sit there and imagine her there.
Okay, so for those who haven't read White Noise yet, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the story.
Sure. So White Noise follows Dr. Laura Fleming, and she's a psychologist at, like I said, a fictional prison in New South Wales called Westmead Prison. And so she inherits this inmate called Justin Jones from a colleague who's had to go onto maternity leave early. And it's Laura's job to assess Justin's suitability for early release onto parole. and that's something that he desperately, desperately wants. Justin, he's pretty handsome, he's pretty charming, he's pretty manipulative, and he's got everyone in the prison sort of believing that he's this model inmate, that he's this reformed character, he's done his time, he's ready to be, released back into the community, and he's going to do good with his life. And so that's how Laura goes into her sessions with him. But as she goes through these sessions and as she spends time with him and sits and talks to him, these alarm bells start ringing in the back of her head, and she starts to think, there's something not quite right about this guy. Meanwhile, in her personal life, she starts falling victim to these series of increasingly personal and terrifying attacks. And so Laura has to work out what's going on, work out who she can trust, who she can't trust, before it's too late.
What I wanted to say in relation to the setting was that it paints a fairly hostile working environment inside the prison, doesn't it?
It does, and some of it was taken from experience, but it is a fictional book, and a lot of it is dramatized for the book.
Yeah. I mean, I never expected that working in a prison would be easy. But for Laura Fleming, she experiences not only hostility from the inmates, but from other staff as well. So tell me about that and why you wanted to explore this in the novel.
I think I wanted to explore Laura working as a woman in a male prison dominated by male officers, and the tension that builds when she's just trying to go into a prison and just do her job every day. And not only does she get this, this danger and this animosity from the inmates, which you would expect, but she also gets it from her colleagues, the people that she's meant to be able to trust and work with, who see her as an intruder on their patch. And I wanted to include that because I wanted to have this simmering sense of unease that Laura isn't safe anywhere. She's not safe in her personal life, she's not safe in her professional life, and just really, really build that tension up to, I guess, a bubbling crisis point.
You absolutely achieved that. Dr. Laura Fleming was a fabulous character who undergoes quite a transformation, I would venture, throughout the events of this novel. But she's broken at the beginning of this novel, isn't she?
She is. She's had a couple of incidents in her past. There was an incident in her previous career as a paramedic, and that led to a painkiller addiction, which stayed with her for years and years and years. And another, without going into any spoilers, another incident falls out of that painkiller addiction, and she holds a lot of shame and guilt really, really close to her heart due to that incident.
Yeah. I mean, we've got PTSD and we've got a painkiller addiction followed by a marriage breakdown. Her husband, or ex-husband, if you will, seems to be intent on punishing her for her past, and she's unashamedly apologetic. You've drawn her guilt and shame so well. I wondered if you had to do a lot of research to get into her mindset.
I did, and I've always been interested in, I guess, the coercive control element of domestic violence. And I really wanted to explore that and put that element in the book. And I wanted to highlight that this type of coercive control, it can happen to anybody. It can happen to, a woman who works in the field, who's a psychologist, who comes across, these type of, cases and perpetrators every day. And I really wanted to highlight that, it is such an insidious thing that occurs, and it can happen, across all levels of education, financials. It doesn't discriminate.
Indeed, and I have explored that with other novelists on this podcast before. But in relation to White Noise, I mean, Dr. Fleming is no idiot. She's a psychologist, she's an ex-EMT. She pulled herself out of tragedy and what happened to her to not only get her life back on track, but to help others. And that's quite remarkable. She's strong, but I don't think she realizes how strong she actually is. Now, whether that's a product of the controlling behaviour that her husband has had over her, throughout her married life and then post her painkiller addiction. But I wanted to ask you, was this something you specifically wanted to explore with her?
It was, and I think I love a flawed character. I love a character who you look at and you would think that this woman at the height of her career has got it all together. She's a psychologist. She's obviously well educated in these kind of things. But I did want to explore the fact that she does harbour this guilt and this shame and this, I guess, erosion of her own self-belief and self-worth, and that has happened from years and years of someone just subtly digging at her self-confidence and making her doubt herself.
Now, I loved your descriptions of the practicalities of working in a prison, especially for someone like Laura, who wasn't a corrections officer. The time needed to clear security, thoughts on how to dress to avoid undue attention, no phones, etc. So, tell me more about that.
Well, that is all based in fact. So there's obviously a really strict process to get into a prison, even before you rock up at the door. You need to go through security checks. They need to, make sure that you're not an associate of, any nefarious person in there. And then when you do rock up, you're not allowed mobile phones or any smartwatches or anything that's linked to the internet once you're in there. Our prisons are biometrically enhanced, so you've got eyeball retina scanners. So you'll go up and you get your retinas scanned. Or if that's for some reason that's not viable, they'll do fingerprint scanning. Then obviously you need to go through a metal detector, make sure you've got no metal on you. So that's the ones that look very similar to, at an airport, the rotor turn sort of ones. There'll often be drug detection dogs in the gatehouse, and you need to go through being cleared by them to make sure that you're not carrying any contraband in. And then, once you're inside, it sort of feels like, because you don't have your phone on you, it does feel like a different world, and you're sort of disconnected from the outside world the second you step behind those walls. So it's a strange feeling.
So someone like Laura wouldn't even have access to the internet from her desktop?
She would have access to the internet from her desktop, yes, she would. But she wouldn't be able to bring, anything mobile in, I guess, that, could be taken off her. Mobile phones are contraband
so that they can't contact anyone outside. Yeah.
That's right. Anyone unauthorized. Obviously, there's prisoner telephone lines within there. There's phone systems, and they're able to contact people who have been pre-approved on their contact list, like family and friends and lawyer, ombudsman, that kind of stuff.
Now, within Westmead, as you said, a fictional prison in Sydney, you describe pressures on the system, overcrowding in particular, and freeing up space in the system or in the jail seems to be one factor that Laura has to take into account in her decision to approve parole for Justin Jones. In your experience of the system, was this something that you witnessed firsthand?
Definitely witnessed the overcrowding and the pressures that puts on the system, and trying to find beds and, move inmates around the state. And obviously that's not a simple process, because, prisoners often need to be near, family, friends, near the court that they're, appearing at. But there's obviously a lot of tensions and rivalries and enemies. So, protectees have got to be moved. You've got to make sure that, certain prisoners aren't housed in the same area as other ones. So it's a very, tough sort of juggling game, I guess. I hadn't noticed anything around added pressure for release onto parole. That was fictionalized, and that was, dramatized. People, work very, very hard, and, those pressures you don't come into it in their decision making. It's, community safety is their number one priority, and they won't release an inmate to parole if they think they're not fit to be released. That's just the end of the story.
Yeah, fair enough.
Mm.
Now, I want to talk about mental health and coping with trauma, and specifically on people who are working in either the justice system or health system, how these people may or may not cope with mental health issues. Now, Laura fears for her reputation if she discloses what happened to her, and specifically becomes widely known that she was addicted to painkillers. I've spoken before on the podcast about a toxic culture that can often mean that people suffering from post traumatic stress as a result of job incidents can be isolated and frozen out or unsupported within their workplace. Is this something that you particularly wanted to deal with? And if so, why?
I was very interested in that, and I wanted to highlight that these things can happen in the workplace, and these incidents can happen that can affect a person, and not only do they have to carry around the trauma and the ongoing effects of whatever happened, the incident, then they have to worry that they're going to be persecuted or looked at differently on the job by the very people that should be supporting them and understanding them and being on their team, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. Do you think Laura feared being seen as weak and unable to be in a position to help others if her experience was widely known?
Yes, and I think it would have undermined everything that she wants to do. Despite all she's been through, she's almost idealistic in her belief of second chances and reformation and helping people. And I really wanted to show a character that has been through all of this hardship. She's been through these awful incidents in her past, but she hasn't let it beat her. And she still is soft and caring and wants to help and believes in redemption.
I want to talk about Justin Jones for a moment. He was a chilling character, to say the least. Was he inspired by a particular person or a psychopathic profile?
He wasn't inspired by a particular person. There was a number of various elements that I pulled together. But I think I've always been interested in people that show one face to the world and then are a completely different person behind closed doors. And I tend to think that for people that, are very, very smart, very charismatic, very good looking, they can sort of sail through the world a little bit easier, and people sort of turn their eye, just a blind eye, a little bit more to people like that. And so I wanted to explore the psychology behind that kind of manipulation and narcissism and psychopathy, really.
In many ways, he was a victim too, wasn't he?
He was, and I wanted to show his backstory and show what he went through in his childhood to get him to where he is, because I didn't want him to be this aggressor, this villain, for lack of a better term, that's just like that because that's what he's like. That's he's just an inmate, so that's who he is. They're all like that. I wanted to show that he did have this traumatic background full of childhood violence and abuse that formed the way he thinks today.
And Laura seemed to be the only one interested in uncovering that, though,
Yeah.
which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. And I think I want to show Laura's dedication and her time that she spends looking into this inmate, and not just looking at surface level and sort of doing a bit of a flick and tick and believing what's told on the surface. I really wanted to show her digging deep and following this gut feeling, I guess, that she had, that at the beginning the evidence didn't really line up, and no one was backing her. She was sort of the solo person that thought that there might be something wrong, and everyone just told her not to rock the boat. The job's basically almost done. Just sign the paperwork, move on to the next one.
And I guess it for me, it highlighted her professional integrity. She inherited this case, but she wasn't just going to tick the boxes that everyone was expecting her to. She was there to do her job, and she was questioning, she was reading, she was looking into things to satisfy herself that he was eligible for parole.
Yes, exactly. And again, I guess without going into too many spoilers, there was an incident in her past, in her paramedic career, as an incident that happened to her that sort of led her off that path, made her decide that she, didn't want to be a paramedic anymore, but led her into this criminal psychology path. And so that incident, I think, has sort of fueled her drive and her passion for the job.
Let's change gears for a moment and talk about your path to publication. You spoke a little bit about it earlier. Tell us about, once you'd written White Noise, what happened? How did you go about seeking a home for your novel?
I finished writing it. I put it away for about a month to 6 weeks, I think, to, as Fiona says, let it marinate. Then I opened it back up again, looked at it with fresh eyes, and I probably did around 4 to 5 edits myself.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of it, I think I just wasn't confident enough that my eyes were enough before I sent it off to publishers. So I engaged a professional editor. Her name's Samantha Sainsbury. I just Googled her, just Googled editors, and her name popped up, and she was just brilliant. She just gave it the most thorough edit, and she came back and she did the compliment sandwich. So she was like, I love your writing, I love the characters, but I hated the ending. And I could see I could see where it was going from about halfway through, but it's got a lot of potential. So that was brilliant, and that was exactly what I wanted her to delve into and give me that feedback. I rewrote the manuscript based on her feedback. I completely changed the ending, completely changed, what was happening, who the aggressor, the perpetrator was. And I sent it back to her after that for a second edit, and she just came back with some sort of minor tweaks, which I took on board. Once I'd finished all of that editing, then I actually sent it back to Fiona, and she sent it off to a couple of publishers. And then I think it was probably only a couple of weeks that, felt like years before I heard back that HarperCollins were interested. So I was working from home at that point, and I don't know if this was happening to you a couple of years ago, but I was getting spam calls every single day, just from unknown numbers. And so I was getting so sick of it. I just decided, if an unknown number pops up on my screen, I'm going to ignore it. If they leave a voicemail, then they want me and I'll call them back. But if not, I'm not going to call them back. And so this unknown number popped up on my screen, and I ignored it, walked away from my phone, and came back when I heard a ding. And I was like, oh, okay, voice message, I listened to it, and it was my publisher, and she said, oh, hi, Mercedes, I'm hoping you might be able to call me back. And then she whispered, and she was like, I've got some very good news for you. And so obviously I called her back on shaking fingers, could, barely get the phone to my ear. I was so nervous. And then she offered me a 2-book deal, and I burst into tears. And I basically couldn't get a word out for the rest of the phone conversation, and she just had to carry the conversation because I was sobbing.
Beautiful.
Yeah, but it's really nice that I made sure I saved that voice message. And, sometimes when I've got writer's block or imposter syndrome or any number of those, other things that crop up for authors, I listen back to that voicemail, and it makes me feel better.
I love that story. That's so wonderful. So, Mercedes, given your experiences to date, I wondered if you had any tips for unpublished writers out there.
I would say definitely my first one would be finish the manuscript. I know lots of aspiring writers who get to that dreaded 30,000 word sort of point in the manuscript, and then another idea comes along, or they think it's too hard, and they swap over to another manuscript, and they never end up finishing that one and then they'll go on to a new one or they'll go back. And I think it's so important just for your own, if not only for getting the manuscript finished, but just for the confidence and the belief in yourself that you can write a manuscript and you can sit down day after day and finish it and get to the end. So I think that's a big one. And I guess tying into that as well is treating it like a job before it is a job. So I'm quite a regimented person and I write at the same time every day, and I write my 1,200 words a day at 5 a.m. and I don't get my bum out of that chair until I've completed that word count. Yeah. And I think that was really beneficial for me because when I got the contract, you know, it is a tight, you know, a tight process. There's deadlines. And, you know, if you're writing a book a year, you need to be able to hit that word count. You need to be able to get your editing done within your deadline, within your time frame. And a publisher, rightly so, will expect that of you. So I think that if you've got those processes and routines and that time carved out in your life beforehand, when you are doing it, you know, to a deadline that you can't move, that process is a lot simpler and a lot, you know, easier to move into. I think people say this one all the time, but it can't be overstated. A writing community, make friends with other aspiring writers, and I couldn't have done it, I don't think, without the help of, you know, many aspiring writers around me throughout the years that you can commiserate with and that encourage you and know what you're going through, I guess, because, you know, so much of the time we are sitting at a laptop in a room by ourselves, that it's wonderful to have that support and inspiration around you.
Now, I would like to think that we were going to see more of Laura Fleming. Are you planning to feature her again?
I am. So I have a second book that's coming out mid next year, and we have just decided on the title. So it's going to be called Black Lies. Ooh. And it's a sequel, but not a sequel. It's a standalone book. But Laura's back. We're back in Westmead Prison. A lot of the same bunch of characters, a lot of new ones in there as well. You don't have to have read White Noise to read Black Lies.
Fantastic. I love it. I can't wait to read that. I mean, having only just come to your book literally in the last few days, it's been on my pile for so long and I've been desperate to get to it. It's like binge watching a Netflix series. You know, you can't wait for the next episode.
Yeah. I love that.
Mercedes, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
Yep, I have a website, mercedesmercier.com. I'm most active on Instagram, so my handle is Mercedes Mercier Writes. I do have a Facebook as well, but yeah, Instagram is where you'll find me most often hanging out.
Mercedes, I'm so thrilled we finally got to chat about your brilliant book, White Noise. I wanted to say congratulations once more and thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudine, and thank you for your really thoughtful, insightful questions. I really enjoyed answering them.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.